Yes, it's number one. It's Top of the Pops.
Well, sadly, it isn't Top of the Pops. Well, not the episode with Caravan on it anyway. In August 1970, the band were known to have mined along to a performance of their latest single, If I Could Do It All Over Again, I'd Do It All Over You. And unfortunately, like so many TV recordings from this era, there are no known copies in circulation. In saying that, remember the video of King Crimson's Cat Food, thought to be lost only to appear 40 years later? Well, maybe one day we may get to see Caravan doing it all over again.
You think I'll get it up, stop enough to slow me down. No, I'll give you everything that I've got if you take me away.
Like most bands from this era, Caravan's life at this time seemed to be one of constant touring. Looking back on newspapers from this era, this feels like the start of a huge horse race with 50 bands jostling in position for the Who Will Be the Next Beatles steeplechase. Some of the fledgling bands found in these small clubs did of course go on to be household names, bands like Genesis, Queen and David Bowie. However, less so the likes of Juicy Lucy, Raving Rupert or Ganindralog. But back in 1970 it felt like any one of them could have been destined for the big time. This was the era of the huge, heavy, hairy music festival, and Caravan played a lot of them over this period, rubbing shoulders with the likes of Deep Purple, Elton John, Yes and Pink Floyd. Not quite your headliners, the band would often be some of the day's earlier acts and sometimes played in smaller side tents, like that at the Plumpton Jazz and Blues Festival, which saw Caravan playing in a smaller tent next to a catering stall, providing munchies in the form of Scotch eggs, pie and mash and rice pudding. Caravan did, however, taste and smell the big time at the huge Rotterdam Music Festival with 200,000 people in attendance, mostly, it seemed, enjoying the pot that was legally sold there. The band came on in the morning after a night of heavy rain with a smog and stench like mist hanging over the crowd, a mixture of evaporating rainwater, a week of unwashed campers and ganja smoke. With festival season drawing to a close, the band proudly announced the birth of their new album, If I Could Do It All Over Again, I'd Do It All Over You. And yes, this genuine advert did receive police complaints at the time. But hey, it was the 1970s, and I'll bet if the band could do it all over again, they'd do it no differently, and I for one wouldn't want them to.
You think who do you think you are?
The band's new album received positive reviews at the time, and it charted reasonably well, suggesting that Caravan were ready to hit the big time, and almost immediately upon its release, they entered Decca's West Hampstead studios to record its follow-up.
Suddenly I heard a ringing, singing, but he was nowhere to be seen.
In researching this documentary, I had the pleasure of speaking with Richard Sinclair about this album and his life in general. I found him to be very much the free-spirited and humorous hippie type that he always has been, a thoughtful and philosophical raconteur with a sprinkling of magic and mischief. He's still playing music as good as ever, and you can find a treasure trove of it on his Bandcamp website, and there's a link to it in the description to this video. Today, Richard can be found in the Puglia district of South Italy, and he lives in one of the distinct Trullo houses there that are noted for their pointed cone roofs, not a million miles away from those found in the land of Grain Pink. So, what is life like in the land of Grain Pink? Well, I sailed away for just one day to take a look. and this is what I saw. Like the album, my own Canterbury Tales started at the golf course that this song is set at. The course can be found on the outskirts of the city, and directly opposite it, on Stodmarsh Road, the band rented a detached cottage, a quiet country retreat where this song and most of the album was written. The cottage is called St Elmo, and it was undergoing building work when I arrived to see it, but the builder showed me a sign to confirm that this was indeed the property. Pi Hastings had wrote the bulk of the band's previous album, and with the short time in releasing this one, he hadn't had time to complete that many new songs. Conversely, the Sinclair cousins, Richard and David, had built up a considerable amount of writing over the last year, and as a result, they dominate the credits on this album. The golf girl in question was Richard's then girlfriend, Pat. In an early take of the song, the tea that she sells, which is probably more than just tea, sold for a bargain price of twopence, meaning 2 pence.
But twopence you can have one.
But by the time the track was released, it had gone up to threepence. Even in the land of grey and pink, one just couldn't escape the 1970s inflation.
For threepence you can buy one.
This was the first song to be recorded for the new album, and it has a lovely jovial quality to it, with Jimmy Hastings' flute fluttering along to it. Helped along by Decca session player John Beecham's fat, laughing trombone. It was issued as a B-side to the Love to Love You single, but Richard Sinclair feels perhaps that this should have been promoted more as a single itself, and it's not hard to see why. Like much of Caravan's output, it has a pleasant and accessible, catchy feel about it. A real smile-evoking introduction to our album.
Her name was Pat, and we sat under a tree. She kissed me.
My Canterbury pilgrimage took place on a cold, wet winter's day, and the skies were indeed grey. Drifting carefree and never knowing where I was going, I took shelter in the many ancient pubs there and did indeed sample some of their winter wine. It's on this track that we really become immersed in the wonderful, cosy and warm production that this album seems to be wrapped up in, and on this day it really was needed. On their previous 2 albums, the band had covered production duties themselves, but on this one they invited in Decca's David Hitchcock to provide ideas and direction, and I spoke with him about his memories and thoughts on this album. He recalled that when the band had produced their previous albums, the individual members seemed to focus too much on their own parts rather than the sound as a totality. Hitchcock described his role, therefore, as being like a referee, and he employed a lot of patience with the musicians who, although great fun to work with, were very strong-minded and opinionated.
Bells chime 3 times, naked dancers enter slowly. Smoky room, scented gloom, audience eating, fat men drinking. Candles burn, dull red light,
illuminates the breasts of poor young girl. Dancing, prancing, provoking, these dreams are always ending far too soon.
The Canterbury of today is still very similar to the one that the band grew up in, with its ancient cobbled streets and cathedral. It has a medieval magic to it, and the lyrics to this song evoke fleeting images of an Arthurian world, of minstrels, maidens and castles. However, like a dream, the words seem to hint at the images subtly, as if we were trying to remember a dream as it disappears.
Life's too short to be sad, wishing things you'll never have.
In a sentiment that its writer Richard Sinclair still holds to this day, the message here is that we shouldn't dream of the past and regret the things that we've never had, and instead look towards the future. In contrast to the previous song, here Sinclair's voice is deeper and richer and closer to us, as if we are indeed carrying him with us through the song.
Carry me with you, carry me with you, carry me with you, carry me with you, carry me with you.
This was recorded in the newly opened Air Studios in London's Oxford Street, and whilst there the band were known to have briefly met the former Beatles producer George Martin.
How you opened up his head and smiled, the rubbish from your mouth you tipped inside.
The studio rates at Air were £35 an hour, which is the equivalent to £500 an hour today, and it's thought that these crippling costs resulted in little funds being left to promote the album after it was made. Accompanied by studio engineer David Grinstead on cowbell, drummer Richard Coughlin settles into a tight groove that skips along and gives the song a summery Kinks-style feel to it. The quirky lyrics foreshadow Pi Hastings' later the dog, he's at it again, and hint at similar sexual shenanigans.
He said without a tone or fleeting glance, I'd like to get deep down inside your pants.
Here the song seems to be from the perspective of a girl refusing a man's advances, with the phrase pigs flying being a metaphor for something very unlikely actually happening. In this case, the man getting deep down inside her pants.
Oh, I would love to love you. Yes, indeed, I do love you. My pigs might fly, that can't be bad. How you have the cheek to smile and tell me I'm mad.
Richard Sinclair has recalled camping down on the Kent coast in Graveney and remembering pink tones filling the sky, and this is where the idea for this song came from. This area is a short drive from Canterbury, an area synonymous not only with Caravan but an entire genre of music. Odd chord changes, slight jazz inflections and extended melodic themes started to become identified with a group of closely knit and overlapping bands, and although many didn't actually come from Canterbury, they all seem to embody the same sort of spirit.
In the land of grey and pink, where only Boy Scouts stop to think they'll be coming back again, those nasty grumbly grimblies, and they're climbing down your chimney, guess they're trying to get in.
For those unfamiliar with England's history and geography, it's worth pointing out that most of our musical innovation comes from our gritty cities like Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Sheffield and the like. The lands north of Hatfield, the lands of smoke and shadows that the orcs and the grumbly grimblies hide in. In the pleasant and more affluent Canterbury landscape, however, you're more likely to find the hobbits of the Shire, with the only smoke there being that from their pipeweed, or punkweed even. There's no doubt that this more laid-back approach gave the likes of Caravan more time for whimsical daydreaming, silly wordplay, and an unashamedly childlike humour. It must be something in the air down there, as even Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the 1300s, are littered with silly puns, fart jokes, and smutty sexuality. Richard Sinclair has stated that his desire at the time was to write nursery rhymes for adults, advice that his father had gave him, and that notion is perfectly captured in this song. The bulk of this track was written in a small basement apartment on the Old Dover Road in Canterbury that David had moved into for a little peace and solitude away from his bandmates. I went to check this area out and discovered that the flat in question was being redecorated and completely empty, without a piano or Hammond organ in sight. However, it was indeed 9 feet underground. In this subterranean solitude, David Sinclair designed several different musical ideas which were then stitched together by the rest of the band in the studio. These separate themes were given silly titles, with the opening being Nigel Blows a Tune, referring to David Sinclair's cousin, Nigel Blow, who is thought to have coined some of its chord pieces. Pye joins in with the Loves a Friend section which he helped to write. His voice has a softness to it, which complements the playing really well.
Don't talk to me about forgiving. So much to do, no more time.
The track progresses into a smooth groove with Sinclair's Hammond organ, which he fed through a variety of effects pedals. But again, unlike many bands from this era, nothing is too over the top, and as a result, the song sounds surprisingly fresh and organic sounding today. The tone settles down with the moody Dance of the Paper Hankies, which refers to one of the Decca engineers tying paper handkerchiefs to string and placing them on a fan so that they would flutter about in the breeze. Much of David's keyboard solos were improvised and played in single takes, with Honestly I Did being his boast to this end. Although producer Hitchcock told me that Sinclair was never really happy with his solos and always wanted to re-record them. Therefore, Hitchcock, sensing that the first takes were often the best, would sneakily keep them to one side, and often these are what went onto the final record. The results are a masterclass of mixing and editing, with the whole suite sounding much more cohesive than many of the disjointed sidelong epics from this era. The penultimate section, Disassociation, is a haunting and melancholic ballad, and arguably the track's crowning glory. The song refers to the detachment that writer David felt that Caravan's music had with other bands at the time. And as if bringing a symmetry to the whole album, Cousin Richard arrives in to bring it all back again.
Will the day be warm and bright, or will it snow? There are people waiting here who really have to know.
The album's inner sleeve featured a short biography of the band to date and a series of silhouettes of them. It's all wrapped up in a wonderful Tolkien-esque landscape of mushroom-style houses and craggy hilltops peppered with lakes and flowers. The cobbled lane invites us to take a trip into the land, meeting its inhabitants and venturing onwards to a distant castle in the horizon. In terms of capturing the quirky and whimsical nature of the music, it's perfect. However, its own story and that of its creator is clouded in mystery. The artwork was created by a Canadian illustrator called Anne-Marie Anderson. There's a story circulating that she was a school kid who won an art competition to design the cover. However, this isn't the case. David Hitchcock states that he first met Anne-Marie at the La Chasse bar next door to London's Marquee Club. It was a watering hole that was well known to those in the music business at the time, suggesting that Anne-Marie may have hung out with other bands, or perhaps she'd gone there just waiting to be discovered. Anne-Marie showed Hitchcock some of her sketches, and he knew instantly that she was the right choice for the band's new album. She was invited to design a few other covers around this time, including another Hitchcock production in folk band Fuchsia. However, after this she seems to have disappeared without a trace. Fuchsia songwriter Tony Durant told me that even he tried to track her down at the time but had no success, and furthermore, none of the Caravan band members have met her either. Finally, to find out more, I spoke with art director Joe McGilligoody. His company ROC Advertising organised the Land of Grey and Pink cover design, and he confirmed that far from winning an art contest, Anne-Marie had studied at art college and she'd only just arrived in the UK when she drew the Caravan cover. Both Joe and David could still recall, even after 50 years, this artist's stunning beauty and long brunette hair. Joe regretfully informed me that there was a tragic end to Anne-Marie's story and that she sadly died at the age of 25 from a heroin overdose.
And it brings it all back to me. Yes, it brings it all back to me.
Joe came across sincere and factual, so I have no reason to doubt him saying this. And I was in two minds as I actually disclose this information here, as I guess it casts a shadow and a grey cloud over the otherwise somewhat pink and pleasant land.
We'll be together all the time.
The album was released in April 1971 with a full-page Melody Maker advert announcing a tour to accompany the release. Reviews were mixed at the time, and perhaps there's an argument that the album was slightly out of kilter with the heavier and more aggressive progressive music that was emerging at the time. The band went on to develop a stronger live presence after its release, but the initial sales were disappointing. It didn't make the official charts, but it did, however, reach number 15 on the Virgin Records mail order charts that were published in Sounds. Over the years that followed, however, the album has gone on to sell hundreds of thousands of copies all around the world and stayed in continual print for decades, and is arguably now more well loved than at any point in its history. Today, Caravan's faraway magical land is just as cosy and comforting as ever, fully matured like a fine old winter wine. So let's raise a glass and toast to all it took us there and back again, all over again.
If I had to do it all over again, babe, I'd do it all over you. If I had to wait for 10,000 years, babe, I'd even do that too. Well, the dog has got his bone in the